Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 4 in our deep dive on Josh Powell, the psychology of Josh Powell. Let's get into it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor, and I see that you're wearing our 15th anniversary merch.
Yes, I love this t-shirt. If I could go back in time, I would wear this t-shirt.
Going back and... Who are you, Berto?
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I am a s'mores policeman.
Okay, so let me bring you all up to speed. Josh is recently been dumped by Katherine. He was controlling and abusive to Katherine, the 16-month relationship, and she waited for him to be at work, and she left the state and then called him on the phone and broke up with him, and this is where he's at. I conceptualize his personality as having been not only abused but also neglected growing up, and he has developed insecure attachment with a leaning towards narcissism and avoidance. And with some people like this, they will emerge into adulthood with a deep, deep longing and need for closeness that they've never had. And when they finally are able to date someone, sometimes this can happen at 10 years of age when there's like a puppy love thing in grade school, or it can happen later in life. I think that's the case for Josh. And he, I think, is hopeful that a soulmate, a wife, will finally be able to give him these normal attachment needs that everyone deserves to be met. I don't think he's consciously thinking that way, but I think that that's true. And in his journal, the way that he talks about these relationships, it's typical in that he's very much in love, the way people write, but also there's a childishness to it and a desperation, and the way that he points this need, he seems to be pointing it at people that are giving every indication that they don't really want to be with him. So it's that narcissistic, but I love her, so that's all that matters in his inability to extend himself or even care. Also, the early relationship of neglect and abuse that we definitely know from the father, possibly from the mother, hard to say, that gets associated with attachment and closeness. Sometimes we can recreate that unknowingly because we're trying to find love and we're going into the memory banks about, well, what does love look like? And if love in the past looked like, because he probably got some love and some attention from both of his parents back then you might once again look for those things again, and you might inadvertently look for the things that actually prevented you from getting those needs met in the past, like unavailability or lack of interest or something like that. And so he's been obsessing on a number of women that have pushed him away. He got obsessed with Katherine, and they ended up being in a relationship, and he was controlling of her. I'm not saying that we should have sympathy for him, given not only what we've heard so far, but also what he does in particular in the future, but I'm just providing my model of understanding these individuals.
We, of course, live in the present, so it's really hard for us to feel that empathy for the things in the past if they became horrible and monstrous along the way. I saw this news report recently. I think it was in Australia or New Zealand. I don't remember exactly. A person did a horrible act. They murdered some people, and I think it was a stabbing or something like that. And then they were interviewing the father, and he was heartbroken.
Oh, is this the recent stabbing?
Yeah.
And he went after women in the mall.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the father said something that really just burns you to the core, which was...
Yeah, I've seen that interview. The father...
He's broken down, and he's like, if you want to love a monster, give birth to him, essentially stating that he of course he can't help but love his son, even though he was such a troubled individual. And
yeah, it's such a, just to interrupt you, I'm sorry. It's such a great interview given the circumstances, because it's a rare combination of that normal love, that typical kind of love that you see from parents that even acknowledge what their child did, but also recognizing how sad and how horrible he feels that his son did. He's already accepted that his son did these. He's not fighting against that.
No.
And he knows the impact that had. And at the same, and as he's talking to the press, he's just spontaneously weaving in and out of those states. And we don't typically see that. Right. We either see someone that is just seemingly rejecting their kid completely, or we're seeing a parent that is just like, you don't understand, he's a good person. He couldn't have done something like this.
And so I can't help but feel empathy for the little versions of all these monsters that were little and defenseless and helpless. And were, as an example, just a horrible other news item I just heard, a little 8-year-old boy died from septicemia and like heart failure, a whole bunch of stuff. He had been very abused, allegedly, by his father and all these things. And I just, it's one of those instances where, like, if that little boy had survived through all that, he might have ended up being a very troubled individual. Maybe he ended up doing some horrible things, or not, right? But no matter what a horrible tragedy befell his short little life. And so, every monster started as a little baby that hadn't done anything wrong yet.
Yeah. In contrast to the point of view that's typical, which is he must have been a monster from day one, and it was obvious. Or
look, and I'll even go further. Even because there have been some documented cases I've seen, at least on YouTube, where they filmed these very, very young children who exhibit absolute like psychopathic tendencies. But I would go as far as saying, like, it doesn't matter. It's not like they chose that. It's all, it's a random universe, right? So like if you're born with some brain alterations that make you psychotic or makes you a psychopath or whatever, I still find a sadness in it. And I find it sad that individual wasn't able to have a quote unquote normal, fulfilling life, let alone all the people that they potentially end up harming, right?
Yeah. And to be specific, if Josh had just a father that was half as abusive,
right,
things would have turned out much different.
So, of course, never excuses any behavior. And of course, we have to, if we catch these things early and give them treatment or incarceration or whatever it needs, of course, because the victims definitely didn't deserve anything. And these young creatures, we all are born as young little creatures, and we didn't choose to be one way or the other to begin with.
Yeah. And to be clear, the individuals that deserve our most sympathy are Susan,
of course,
and the two boys.
Who were also born little creatures that didn't know what was going to happen to them.
Yeah. And that's clear. We understand that. And I think it's okay to recognize that the Joshes of the world are also human beings. Maybe they deserve to be behind bars their entire life.
Well, that's just it. Like, we've said this before with other contentious topics, but it's so much harder to take out the emotion after the fact. What if we could try to take the emotion before the fact? And what I mean by that is, if we could be like, this individual right now, maybe they're 18, maybe they're 15, whatever. They seem like they're heading in a troubled path. They need a lot of assistance from the government, from the system. They need a lot of help. Let's do that now, because it's a lot, even if they've done some bad things. Maybe they're a delinquent. Maybe they've robbed. Maybe they've been a bully or whatever. But let's do it now, because it's a hell of a lot harder to be compassionate after they've done horrific things.
Yeah, and in the past 3 chapters, we've been going over Josh's childhood and early adulthood, and there's some fairly advanced abusive behavior with Katherine in terms of control and isolation. And at the same time, what I see is a typical sort of client that I would see who might get mandated to see me or might end up in my office voluntarily, who exhibits this kind of behavior. And what I see is a scared, hurt, abused, neglected child that with healing will tend not to do those things in the future. And so all these things can be true. We can acknowledge the victims and say they deserve the most care and acknowledgement from us. At the same time, the Joshes of the world, because if we're going to prevent this from happening in the future, I think that's the important point of view.
Imagine this bizarre world where in the first few days or maybe weeks of the relationship with Katherine, she lives in a world in which she's aware, all her friends are aware, everyone and their mothers is literally aware of signs, patterns, and what to do, and there's a system ready to help.
Right.
So instead of like, well, it's a new relationship, I guess I got to deal with it. It's like, oh, I see what this is. I know what this is.
Right.
And like,
yeah, it's interesting when you say it like that. It seems so obvious, but just so bizarre that one, if you had a different society that raised Catherine in such a way that very quickly she would recognize that she was in an abusive, because she didn't recognize she was in an abusive relationship until she had kind of randomly, subconsciously extracted herself from his house, from their shared home when he was at work. She didn't think of herself as being an abuse victim until later. If she had
and the abuser doesn't think of themselves as being an abuser either.
No. And so at the very least for her, she could have gotten out earlier or did something earlier. But at a more advanced level, what if our society had an awareness and an understanding and an uncomplicated approach to people like Josh that exhibit signs of abuse and control, and at least gave him an inviting opportunity to engage with therapy or healing or a support group, or maybe there's another guy who used to be like Josh and like a big brother kind of situation, just a pal. It's like, hey, I just want to say, like Mormons, if there was someone in the church maybe that said, hey, let's go fishing, and I just want to tell you a story. I heard something from you, and what do you like to do? Oh, you like to buy tools. Okay, well, let's go to the Home Depot and play with tools. I just want to tell you a story. And then that plants a seed, and that builds, and there's an effort, and it's uncomplicated, and it's non-shaming. Instead of just looking the other way or not even knowing that this thing is happening, or looking at their relationship and thinking, oh, what good traditional marriage this is looking like. Like it's tragic that we don't have this kind of society, and it just sounds ridiculous to propose such a thing, but why not?
Well, even because imagine a little boy shows up to school and he's got like a black eye, right? And it's like, what happened? So the way we operate, and I know why, I mean, we would all be like, wait, is his dad hitting him, right? Which is terrible. And then it becomes this big taboo. Like, should we go say something? And of course, that's the way it has to be, in quotes, I suppose, right now, because it is this big taboo, the scary subject. No one should talk about it. But imagine a different reality where while it's just, I hate to say the word just, but instead of like the boy was murdered by his father, the boy was hit by his father. So while it's that, the society kind of circles the wagons, but with the father in the wagons. Mm-hmm. Like, hey, listen, this is actually completely, it's well understood.
Yeah, this
happens, and you're in pain, and like, and here's all the steps, and here's the things we can help. Now, in some cases, people might be too far gone, whatever. But I feel like there's such a range. That is unmet.
and part of the problem is how black and white we are with these individuals. Right. Not only just our conceptualization is they must be monster, right, but also when we come across like a father that exhibits they might have hit their child, they're dead to us. We want to string them up. They deserve to be thrown away in prison for the rest of life, or canceled, or never allowed within a mile of a child in the future. And that's just not a realistic way of looking at these things.
And the sad result is that likely what ends up happening is the boy gets abused more and more and worse and worse and worse.
Exactly.
And no one ever does anything about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's not actually protecting anybody, because it complicates things so greatly, not only for the abusive person, they're extremely unlikely to ask for help from anybody or tell anybody. And if there's any implication, they're going to come out strong against it. But also, the boy loves his father and knows that that's going to be the reaction, or senses it, and also doesn't come forward, right? So there's all these problems that emerge from our kind of childish way of looking at these things. And so I think by telling the story of Josh Powell, I think that's one of the hopes that you and I have, is to flesh it out, to provide the humanity in here, and to see a missed opportunity that is common in situations like this. So it's the year 2000, and Susan Cox enters the story. Josh meets her. He's 24 at this point. It's late year 2000, and Susan was 19 at the time. I think some people hypothesize that he's looking for a young, impressionable person. It's hard to say. They both went to the church, and it's not uncommon, given averages. I think the average is that there's a 2 or 3 year age gap. So, it's not far from that. But at the same time, it's absolutely possible, given his track record, that he might be more attracted to younger, more impressionable people. It's hard to imagine him approaching a woman that was 5 years older than him, right?
But there is something telling. Usually at 24, whether you went to college or not, you're certainly like working. If you're lucky enough to have a job, you're working. You're trying to establish yourself. You're and maybe it's more common if you are in environments like a church where different ages mix more frequently.
Yeah.
At work, it's interesting because a lot of 19-year-olds probably wouldn't be working yet in this country.
Well, she was, which is another possibility, is that she was very responsible. Mm-hmm. She was more responsible than the typical 19-year-old. She, career-wise and responsibility-wise, was probably more like a mid-20s or late 20s individual. But anyway.
Did she go to college? Do you know?
She went to
like a
trade school for cosmology, Gene Juarez, actually. So let's watch a video. This is 2020 on ABC. They did a whole mini documentary about this case. And let's watch the portion of the 2020 video that tells the beginning of their relationship.
That show the couple's blossoming relationship.
You'll cut that out of the tape, right?
When I first met Josh, guess I thought he was cute. He was very confident, and he thought he could get any girl he wanted.
So, Berto, what do you think of seeing Josh as a confident, smiling young man? It's different, I think, than my vision of him. What do you think of that?
Well, it's on tape, number one. Number two, everyone has a wide range of emotions throughout their day and life, right? So I'm not too shocked by it. And I also think when you're starting a relationship, you're on your best behavior. But there's a couple interesting things there, like the mention of that he thought he could get any girl he wanted or something. That's definitely that comment is very telling, right? It's like, because you don't necessarily think that just because someone's good looking, right? There's something about their behavior that would give you that.
Right. You can look at someone and say, wow, they probably
could
have no problem dating. As another observation of he thinks or he knows he can get anyone he wants. Right. That says that he's communicating or signaling or needing everyone to know that he's a catch, or that he's a good partner, or that he's intelligent or smart or good looking, or whatever it is. So we'll add that to another aspect of narcissism.
And there's a potential odd message there, which is because the context here is like, hey, they were meeting, their relationship was blossoming. And there is something odd if like the impression isn't, oh, he's so into Susan. Like it's like, well, he thinks he can get anyone.
Right. And that's another pattern that I observed when I was listening to all of his journals, his audio journal, and reading his journal and hearing the story, that when the young woman was unavailable, he was very expressive of, you're great. I love you so much. You're so special. I want to be with you. But with Katherine and now with Susan, because they're actually interested in him, he's more standoffish, and maybe even more saying things like, yeah, I can get anyone I want. I think he even wrote that in his journal of, once someone finally showed interest in him, then in his journal he would say, oh, I don't know if I want to give up my options, which is in contrast to the previous day's journal entry where he's like, I just want a wife. I want someone to love me. I want a companion.
But that does track to the fear. Right. The fear is, well, first of all, and all of this subconsciously, like, well, I got to make sure that I appear like they need me way more than I need them, because I can't bear to lose them.
Right.
And so,
Right. So let's watch more.
Just tall, dorky, his head's too big for his shoulders. He just looked awkward.
He's got a job, he's got his own place, and he's going to college. It's sounding pretty good.
He's going to go to school for business, so he's somebody who is bright when he applies himself.
They quickly
Right. So this is perhaps the only time in Josh's life where he looks like a success.
Yeah.
He is graduating from the University of Washington with a business degree, which is, kind of a big deal. And I think at this time he might have a job at Microsoft, actually. And he's commuting from Tacoma to Redmond.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, he had a job at Microsoft for a bit. And he is confident and things are working out for him and smiling. And he just seems like he's got the world at his fingertips. But prior to this, he would not have that kind of confidence or indicators of success. After this, he also will never have it again. So Susan Cox and the family arrived at the exact wrong time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In terms of his general appeal, I think.
Meaning wrong time because it looked appealing.
Right.
Yeah. I see.
fell in love. You see pictures of them. They looked to be completely smitten.
Josh and Susan's relationship goes from not knowing each other at all in October to being engaged by the end of December.
So let's talk about love bombing for a second, because I'm guessing people will think about that. It's a common internet trope to talk about narcissism and love bombing. And in this situation, it actually applies in that we've already been over his possible vulnerabilities and his neediness and the neglect and the abuse that he's been through. And for these individuals, because they have so much need and so much unmet need, that when they finally find that oasis in the desert of neglect and pain, they run and don't want to let go. And they want to rush forward with the relationship, not because they're Machiavellian and trying to lasso this helpless individual, but because they are, in the way that we all are, desperate for closeness and in love and infatuated. They don't see any reason to go slow because I'm in love and you're in love and let's get this train moving, The difference, though, is what happens when the other person pushes back. That's the way I see it.
Well, and totally. And I do think some individuals, and more importantly, probably some organizations, do end up doing very deliberate, orchestrated love bombing.
Right. So the more rare form of love bombing is purposeful, not only by psychopathic or abusive dating partners, but also organizations, cults, this kind of thing, or some sort of internet group or whatever. But even with cults and with groups, religions, they might love bomb, but they're not purposely trying to manipulate. They're just really interested in you and they really want other members or whatever it is, So for Josh, he was seemingly doing that. He was rushing forward because she would say, hey, I kind of want to be engaged a little bit longer. I don't want to get married right away, because they get married pretty quick. They get engaged pretty quick. They move in pretty quick. They get married. And so she pushes back, and he doesn't want to go slow. The way they talk about it in the interviews, people who were witness to this relationship and its beginning, was that it didn't take much to convince her. So I don't know if I would characterize it as love bombing, because if she had really drawn a boundary and said, no, I really want to be engaged for at least a year.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get married within the first year of knowing you or whatever. We don't know what he would have done. Now, we could imagine what he would do, given his track record with Katherine. He was certainly capable of bulldozing and becoming abusive and pressuring and getting overly upset and abusive. But we'll never know, because she seemingly was just mildly on the fence, and then once he was like, no, let's move forward, then she was like, okay, yeah, let's do it. I'm in love. And I think it's important to see this depiction, because when you hear the whole story, it's easy to, at least for me, to not imagine the normal parts of their relationship. Look at them. They're smiling, they're in love, they're hugging, they look like they're effervescent and hopeful and happy, and and she's in love with him. You know,
Right.
in fact, throughout their relationship, even during the bad times, she was really into him and focused on him and attracted to him, and was really bummed out that they weren't having sex as much, later on.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to see this, because if we're going to fully understand these kinds of stories, because typically this is how these stories will start, where it just looks normal. Not that we need to be paranoid about everyone we're dating,
No.
but that he might have been saved, as we were saying earlier, if he were to be put on a path of healing and recovery. But that didn't happen, so let's continue watching.
Those videos also capture Josh and Susan's wedding and the home life they built together after.
Susan looked very pretty at her wedding. Very traditional, long white dress.
So you put the ring in that box and opened it up.
What is it like to watch?
I mean, it's an immense amount of sadness that I feel, because this is everyone's videos. This could be anyone's videos. Like, this could be my wedding. This could be any number of things. And, you can, in retrospect, look at any of these things, and especially if you put scary music or whatever, be like, oh, you see how you just looked or whatever. But it's not. It's just videos of people talking about their future together and their things. Just knowing that the future held such horrible, incomprehensibly horrible things.
Yeah.
It just makes me so sad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Put it on.
She was very excited to show off Josh and start their lives together.
Let's see the ring. Let's see that ring. Hold your hand up, please.
It's a young person's love story that quickly becomes dark.
So I think it's important to see this footage, because it just looks so normal.
Yeah.
Just so unscary. There's no indication. And the future is not set in stone.
No.
Like we were talking about. Okay, so let's take a break. When we get back, let's talk more about Susan. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. So let's talk about Susan and her personality. She was a very responsible person. She is 19 at this point, but she's already very good with money and very good with working. She's very dependable, and she's very independent financially. When they met, she was a trained cosmetologist, which is skin and hair. She was trained at Jean Juarez, a local cosmetology school here in the Northwest. And Josh, on the other hand, had a number of failed jobs and careers by this point. He's 24, so it's not super strange. But as we've already been over, he was really into architecture. He started that as his major. Then he wanted to be an actor when he was at the University of Washington. At some point, he switched to technology and software. It's the late 90s. So.
By the way, I will say something. That, unless it's a bad economy, which at this point it wasn't yet, there's a difference between, I've certainly had a lot of jobs, when I was younger. I mean, luckily I've had the same job for ages now, but there's a difference between having a lot of different jobs and like losing or, having really weird ways that you get in trouble at different jobs.
Yeah.
That kind of chaos has a different mechanic to it.
Right. Well, that's skipping ahead, because later he will blow out of a whole number of jobs. So I'm sort of going into the future, but he'll blow out of his Microsoft job pretty quick. He will eventually work at a senior center in Yakima and blow out of that job pretty quick. He started as a long-haul truck driver at one point, and even kind of started working as a long-haul truck driver. And there's no theme here.
Yeah.
I mean, architecture, acting, Microsoft, senior center worker, long-haul truck driver. Then eventually he goes into real estate in Utah, a number of years from this point. And it's kind of the perfect job for him, because it, certainly there are a lot of hardworking real estate agents out there, for sure. But if you're looking for greatness, then real estate will potentially have that promise, right?
Right, because you can make a bang load of bucks.
Yeah. especially if you start buying homes yourself.
And it can be your picture on the freeways,
Right.
Call our Josh line.
Yeah. Also, it allows for ambiguity to your schedule and to your income, right? You go, I got a deal coming up. Because by that point, I think he suspected that he wasn't very conducive to career. Also, you don't necessarily have to interact with other coworkers or superior. You're not in the office necessarily all the time underneath the thumb.
Right. You can be kind of your own boss.
Right.
As long as you're making money.
Yeah. Whereas other jobs, he would experience conflict with his boss pretty quickly. But Berto, what do you think, given what we know about him, why would he, up until this point and into the future from the wedding point, would he, what is it about his personality that would cause that to happen?
That's so fascinating because, there's a lot of things that you've mentioned so far about his background, his relationships, that I can even relate to. Obviously not the more extreme sides, but things where I'm like, yeah, man, I felt that. And clearly, a lot of these things have to do with the way you're raised and the trauma you have as a kid and all these things. But this one is interesting because that's not something I can relate to. I dreamed as a little child of, because, have you ever had s'mores?
Mm-hmm.
Do you burn the marshmallows?
Define burn.
Like carbon.
Well,
Is there black?
A little bit.
Yeah. Ew.
But there's a perfect amount. Like, I want it to catch on flame, the whole thing, for like half a second.
Oh, God. Okay,
so it'll be brown and crispy.
This is why I went on my lifelong crusade. But anyways, I digress. The point is that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out what is it that feeling would be that I can relate to. And here's what I think. Because I can't relate to that with like professionally or what I want to do with jobs. But there is an aspect of the fluttering in the wind, which I have experienced, which is the desperate desire for financial security. And I've talked about this before. There were times where I fluttered in the wind trying a whole bunch of different things to see if I could make a lot of money because I desperately need to not end up financially destitute. I need to have security, right? And that feeling of like restlessness and like, what do I got? I got to do something. I can relate to that.
Instead of just starting from the bottom and working your way
Save,
up.
invest wisely. Don't overinvest, but take a couple risks after you have a base like that. No, it's like, gosh darn it, if I don't make it now, I'll never make it. So I need to take all the risks all at once.
And I think you're implying that you shot yourself in the foot at times.
Oh, absolutely. I came very close to bankruptcy for spreading myself too thin, coupled with an incredible amount of bad luck too. But anyways, that I can relate to. I can relate to like floating in the wind. And that, of course, comes from damage.
Okay. What's going on with your personality?
In my case, it was the feeling of insecurity I felt. This is my psychoanalysis of myself. Growing up in Colombia in the 80s, in my household with a house that was literally collapsing. Like my grandparents had to move out of their bedroom because the roof was collapsing in their bedroom. There was no money to fix it. So that room forever again was never used again. And like that kind of stuff.
Like with the rain coming in?
The ceiling up above didn't have a leak, but the between the attic and it collapsed, and there was no money to fix it. So that room became uninhabitable. Stuff like that. Breaking down, no money to fix. With my dad, no job, no money, no income. Everything around me collapsing, society collapsing, bullets going through our windows, everything collapsing, right? So I think, of course, the trauma. Oh, and then anytime I would get money, like, oh, here, happy birthday, here's some money. It would fly out of my hands immediately. So I learned.
By your family.
By my dad.
Right, by your dad.
I learned, it's a very scary, unstable world. And at any minute, I will be destitute. And every tragedy is just around the corner.
Yeah. Meanwhile, giving you a lot of pain and shame about not having enough, like your friends at school might have.
Right, exactly.
So you get it coming and going.
Yeah.
Where also as an adult, you would become extravagantly spending.
Exactly.
As a way of not only like trying to please everyone around you, but you wanted to show those pesky salesmen that you have money. And so I'll buy that $5,000 coat.
Are you trying to imply I can't? You think I'm one of those low class individuals that can't, that has roofs collapsing in their house? No, sir.
Yeah.
I will prove you wrong. That, plus this desperation of like, I got to make it. I got to have financial security at all costs. Place bets here, there, everywhere. So I can relate to that. The difference here, I guess, it's more about like what he wanted to do professionally. In this case, like, what he wanted to spend his time doing.
Well, given what you know about Josh's childhood and his damage, what do you think might have fueled his flightiness?
So his dad, abusive, unstable family relationship, unstable household. His dad eventually, them separating, and then him having to make this decision. Should I go with my dad? Should I go with my mom? I guess, I'll go with my dad. Like, maybe that ambivalence of like no stable footing. And two things. One, it might bring him some weird, bizarre comfort to not feel stable footing, because that's what he experienced.
Yeah.
Coupled with not knowing how to arrive at stable footing.
Yeah. And I don't know what sort of modeling he had from his dad regarding career, but let me provide my possible factors that I, of course, can't know, but these are things that, given what I know so far, could have been in play. So we will find out later that some of his jobs later, he will quit suddenly or be fired because he will be in conflict with management, because he thinks that he knows more than they do, that kind of thing. Wasn't always the case, but was the case at least a couple times. So the first thing we want to look at is narcissism. So he, due to his early childhood development, needed to believe that he was superior and better and smarter. And he was very smart. We looked at his IQ test. He was at the 97 percentile.
Yeah, legitimately had intellectual horsepower.
Right. He probably knew that. He probably knew that he was smart and could put things together. So that doesn't help his narcissism, you know?
Sure.
There's a difference between having a high IQ and having the know-how regarding how to communicate and work within a team, and also know your position and da-da-da. And it seemed like he would blow out of jobs within weeks.
Yeah.
It wasn't like 5 years later. It was seemingly very quick.
Yeah.
And also, some of the jobs he would have, like in Yakima, him and his wife would move.
And see, this I do remember. I remember hearing about all the...
Right. And a lot depends on that. Plus, you know, you're putting a lot of effort. You're renting a new apartment. You're meeting new people.
Like, that's something I can't relate to because I've never moved for a job.
Yeah. So you'd think you would try to make it work, you know, and quickly he would blow out. So if you have this constant need to be seen as superior when you're in a new job, I think anyone can relate to this. You feel like you're an idiot. It just feels like you have no idea how to do anything. Like you don't even know how to walk down the hallway anymore. You know, you don't know how to say hello to people anymore. Like you just feel like nothing is working, and that would challenge anybody.
And it's not even because there's the whole imposter syndrome, but it is a fact that when you start a new job, you actually literally don't know a lot about the new job.
Yes, that's what I tell my students. I will, at the beginning of graduate school, I'll draw the bell curve on the whiteboard and say, here's the learning curve of a therapist. I do not know everything there is about this job. So I put myself at like the 50% mark. You know, there's a lot I have yet to learn, right? And I draw backwards in time in terms of my competence level to the first term of graduate school, and I'm basically at like 0.1%. And I point to everyone in the class and I say, you are at 0.1%, maybe 0.2%. I don't know. But
well, yeah, if you're a genius, you're twice, which means 0.2%.
Yeah. Maybe you're older than me because I entered graduate school when I was 24.
Sure.
Maybe had more therapy experience, maybe have had undergrad in psycho, whatever. But you are incompetent by definition.
Yeah.
And I say this and everyone kind of chuckles because on one hand, it's like, oh, I'm being, the students are like, I guess I'm being seen, because graduate students in psychology in particular, I think, put all this expectation on themselves that they're going to be already good at psychology and therapy before they are trained. You know, there's this sort of expectation.
Full disclosure, I did in college. I had an internship at Microsoft. And I got to tell you, I wish someone had sat me down and explained to me these ideas. Like, hey, listen, just so you know, you're not you can't possibly know everything you need to know for this job. So if you're going to do one thing, ask questions.
Right. So if you have a narcissistic injury in particular, and you have that incursion on your confidence,
yeah,
and that worry of being rejected or fired and thrown to the wind, just financially, but also just emotionally, then you're going to resort to some defense, right?
Oh,
and
totally.
If your defense is that you're superior and smart and you know shit, then you're going to have to establish that, and that might butt up against your abilities, but also with authority.
It was a horrible experience. I actually ended up doing really well, but I actually suffered, like my health suffered. I ended up getting like horrible like stomach cramps and things. Like I was stressed to all hell, because what would happen is manager would come in and he's like, all right, I need you to do this, install, and he would use all these jargon words that I had never heard in my life. And I would like try to take a couple notes, and then I would sit there in my office like, what the F am I supposed to do? And instead of being like, sorry, I need to ask you a few questions, which actually later on in life I would learn is a mark of great intellect, to be able to seek help, right? Instead I'd be like, oh, I'll just have to, I don't know. And then inevitably there were times early in the internship where it was like, oh, wait, so you don't know blah? Oh, no, I guess I don't. Oh, why didn't you say that? Okay, well, that's what this is.
Right. Another intern might have signaled, might have looked like, what am I doing? Or have said, I don't know what that is.
Oh, in fact, I've seen those people, and I used to, it's so silly. When I was younger, I used to look down on it, and then later I admired it, which was the new person who you're saying something, and they're like, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about right now. When I was younger, I was like, oh, geez, okay, it's one of these idiots. Right. And later I was like, oh, no, that's what you need to do.
Right. It's a immature way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So to be clear with my students, I'm not wanting them to feel shitty about themselves. I am telling them, and I say this explicitly, to release themselves from the narcissistic notion that they already know something, having not been through graduate school yet, and just allow yourself to not know.
Yeah.
And allow yourself to quote unquote fail. It's not really failing. You're just living up to the expectations of someone that has no idea what they're doing, and just allow yourself that. Because the other thing is, a lot of graduate students in my program anyway, they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. They're not used to starting over, right? It's a second career for them. Anyway, for me, I'm on the narcissistic spectrum, like at 5%. And when I was 23, graduated from the same school that Josh Powell did, a business degree, and thought, well, there will be a job waiting for me as soon as I graduate. And there wasn't. And
hello, is this Kirk? Did you just, oh yeah, we have a business job for you.
Yeah. I didn't even think they'd call me. I thought they'd just be standing there after graduation. And I had no idea what I was doing, because, in my family, that sort of process of a degree, one, and two, like networking and internship.
Right.
Like no one told me anything about that. I found myself applying to jobs through the newspaper, because the internet didn't exist. And so I was getting no response, and I was getting occasional response. And then eventually I'm working at Foot Locker selling shoes with a business degree, and just looking at myself and thinking, I am a piece of crap. I'm on the phone with my grandfather, my mom's dad, and he later on, I only knew him as a very successful construction guy. He was one of the top builders in Spokane.
Okay.
With the Spokesman Review, their main newspaper, he was Man of the Year one year.
What? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he was
incredible.
well known, just because he was a builder. I only knew him as that big shot. And so I'm talking with him on the phone, I'll never forget, and he kind of senses where I'm at, and he says, Kirk, I started out as a cement mixer. And so you don't become a builder overnight. I started out at the lowest job. He was telling me the cement mixer guy was the lowest of the low. Like no one wanted to be the cement mixer guy. And eventually he became some other part of the construction team, and then eventually he became foreman, and then eventually he was architect or manager, and then eventually owner, and then da-da-da. And
a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll.
Right. And so he tells me this, and we had a bit of a conversation, and it just clicked in my head, and I was like, oh. Okay. So where do I start at the bottom? And it just completely reoriented myself. And it's possible that for Josh, given the signs of narcissism that we have seen, that he could not tolerate that start from the bottom aspect.
Sure.
And with the imposter syndrome, as an incursion to his self-esteem and to his security, he would resort to a typical defense of grandiosity, and I'm better, and I know things more than you do, and he would get into conflict. Also, if you have significant narcissism, you will be envious of people that have more than you.
Yeah.
And you will want to possess it or even try to tear them down, maybe talking shit about them behind their back or whatever. So that's one factor that I think could have led to his meandering career. Because at the age of 24, he's already been through a number of different random jobs and career endeavors. Another aspect of narcissism is that, like what you were talking about, Berto, is you don't just want a normal career. You want a grand career. You want something that is prestigious and makes you a lot of money and is flashy, that fits how you see yourself, And so he was reaching for the stars without having a path for it. Okay, so that's one.
I also do wonder if at that point, because earlier you were saying that when he was younger, it didn't fit a lot of the psychopath patterns. But at this point, that is one of them, right? Like not being able to hold down a job. That is one of the
to be irresponsible and to be a mooch, because he eventually becomes completely dependent pretty quickly, actually, on Susan's responsible career path.
And the fact that he was like, see here, certain things like with Katherine, he was starting to get all her checks and deposit into his account, right? That's using someone so directly, right?
Yeah.
And it's,
I guess, good point. I hadn't thought of that.
It's like something that starts to creep in, right? There's other psychopath stories where you're like, well, geez, at the age of 13, they were already doing all these crazy things, right? But this one, it seems almost like it just kind of like slow burn, and then eventually it starts showing more and more symptoms.
Right. It depends on what the foundation of this behavior is for him. For the psychopath, the typical psychopath, is they aren't interested in being responsible consciously. They actually think that it would be so much better to just use someone else.
Right. Because they don't have that compunction. They're like, oh yeah, I don't.
Yeah, they consciously are manipulating so that they don't have to work because they don't want to work.
Yeah.
In the same way that if you forced like a 7-year-old to work for their rent or something, they would probably, in a healthy way, figure out a way out of that, right? So it's that kind of thing. Whereas for him, I think it could have been other factors where consciously he wasn't, setting out to mooch, but because of his issues, it led to that. And I think narcissism could have been a part of that. Another strong possibility of a factor is that with his dad, you remember, his dad was very permissive and also would tear down the mom's attempt to establish any kind of structure.
Oh, and he was also very anti-establishment in general.
Right. Even for Stephen, the father, he hated the Mormon church.
That's right.
He hated the authority.
So that definitely sets up a system of like any job would seem oppressive.
Right.
Yeah.
And hierarchy and authority are common in not only a job, but also in a career path.
Right.
If you're an architect, you probably have to work under a senior architect or a mentor or supervisor or something, a professor, right? And since he never learned that, and he talks about in his journal, he laments that his dad never taught him that, that his dad was so anti-authority and never put his, well, the thing with Stephen is that he was 95% of the time would not only let his kids, particularly his boys, do whatever they wanted to, but also would kind of encourage it. But then when something went wrong and the boys got in his way, then Stephen would come down like an anvil on top of the boys, particularly on Josh, maybe because he's the oldest boy, I don't know.
Yeah.
And so for Josh, he never learned hierarchy. He never had to understand authority. It didn't give him the chance to even evaluate, is this authority I want to respect or not? Because his dad was such a chaotic father, almost like another child, and any authority in his life, like his mom, would be completely undercut by Stephen, the father. So I think that's another possible factor as to why Josh meandered through his career in his life. Because, spoiler alert, I think a major motivation to kill Susan was because of his failures in his career and his failures financially. It's hard to know, but I think it was the catalyst that pushed him over the edge, which I'll get to in a later chapter. And the last factor that I can think of is that he, I think, probably experienced fairly significant attachment and security as an infant. I don't know that. Again, I don't want to throw the mom under the bus, but there are indications that she might have had some challenges with bonding. At the very least, there's 5 children that are pretty close in age.
Yeah.
Maybe the mom was stressed out. Certainly Stephen wasn't helping in any sort of material way. So I imagine that he was neglected. Maybe because he was an easier infant than the other. I don't know. But he shows some signs of that. And if that were true, then for some people like this, they will grow up with a hole in their heart that they want to fill by acquiring a mother to take care of them. And they will have a subconscious need to recreate the environment that an infant it goes through, of a complete mother that takes care of everything that you need, right?
Yeah.
They feed you, they put you to bed, they wake you up in the morning. Certainly you don't have a job. They change your diapers, they tell you what to do, they protect you from the world, they do everything for you. We all deserve that when we are young. When we don't get that, we carry with us a deficit and an unmet need.
Right.
And with healing corrective experiences, we can manage that. Like for you, Berto, we talked about, I think in the last chapter, about how the neglect that you went through early in life, you cobbled a healing regimen through your relationship with your wife after being with her for 27, 28 years, right?
Right.
And she has taken care of you and loved you and accepted you and not rejected you. You've had your ups and downs and you've had your conflicts, but every day of she's there. She didn't leave. She's not abandoning you. She cares. She is considerate. She's thinking of you. That is filling that hole that you always wanted. And through that, you have healed, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. There are ways, of course, in which these kinds of holes can never be fully filled. I really do believe that you can probably go, a billion years, and then there's some things in that little early brain development that just like, it's similar to how you can't, my mom's been here forever in the States, and she still has an accent when she speaks in English, and that's because her ear was an adult ear when she started learning English.
Right.
And so similarly, I think, but that said, yeah, absolutely. Like the combination of therapy, podcast, and a healing relationship in which we both honestly put a lot of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like, it's, and the other thing, I still always attribute some of this to luck. Mm-hmm. There's an incredible amount of luck that we ended up sticking together, that we didn't give up at this time or the other, and that my neurochemistry wasn't extreme enough, and that neither was hers. But in the end, it feels good to like you said, like fill in. It's like, you're shoveling some dirt back into the hole.
Right. So I think along those lines, for Josh, there's a possibility that he was at least partially trying to recreate that dependency that he missed out on being met by not being responsible in life, by looking for a partner like Susan, who was very responsible. She was both young and impressionable.
Right.
We could maybe hypothesize that he was attracted to her for that. She also seemingly, even throughout their marriage, had a, I don't know if I want to say childish, but kind of with blinders on. She approached marriage even late in their relationship when she was already thinking he might kill her. She is writing in her journal about how she wants to have a baby girl with him.
Oh,
and she's like begging him to have sex so that they can have, because she had 2 boys. She really wanted a baby girl, and she's talking about maybe I can have twins. I'm not saying that's a pathological thing. It's just a quirk of her personality. But there's that aspect that he might have been attracted to, and she can be mommy. I don't have to work.
Yeah.
She will take care of me. And since he was so money oriented, you could see him really focusing on that and subconsciously sabotaging or quickly and flippantly just throwing away careers. And because it's contradictory for him to show narcissism and avoidant attachment style and the pathological independence while exhibiting extreme dependency regarding work. Like for me, and I think for you, there is no possible part of me that considers, well, if things don't go well with my career, I'll just depend on my wife.
No, right.
Like that never crosses my mind.
Right. It's inconceivable.
and it's pathological, I think, for the two of us that we don't even consider that as an option.
Right.
It just doesn't even come up, right? It's like I have to do everything myself. I can't ask for help. I can't depend on anybody.
And like I said, so in my case, a lot of that was that damage of like, I saw how dependent my dad became in life. And like, it'll be a cold day in hell if I let myself go down that path.
Right. So there's that. That gets us into their marriage, Josh and Susan. But I want to get into Stephen Powell's obsession with Susan.
Oh, yeah.
That's a very important part of the story. And if you, dear listener, have never heard this part or you've only heard the headlines, it's way worse and way more detailed than you would imagine. Not only just the nature of Stephen Powell, the father's infatuation with his daughter-in-law, but he wrote and kept extensive journals describing what he was doing, committing several crimes that he would eventually serve time for. And we're going to watch clips from his video journal.
Yeah.
It's disturbing.
Oh.
So let's get into it. But first, let's take a break. And the rest of this episode is going to be for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to listen to this, become a patron of the podcast.
You can't spell love without patron.
Yep. And otherwise, if you're not a patron, then we will sign off here. So please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.